Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Roundup. This week on our panel, we have Justin Bennett.
Hey, everyone.
Nader Davitt.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. This week, we have a special guest, and that's Adam Laycock. Adam, do you want to say hi?
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Hey, folks, I just want to let you know quickly about Netlify. Netlify is a really cool system for hosting what are traditionally known as static sites. However, the real benefit that I've been finding is that I don't have to mess with a back end. I can just set things up. I build the website out. I've been using a system called 11DJS, and you just deploy it. And then anything that you have that you want to do, you can do on the front end. So if you want to pull in some kind of database with Firebase or something else, if you want to collect form data, Netlify provides all kinds of services that make it easy to do all that stuff. If you're trying to do serverless, they have a really, really neat serverless setup that will allow you to deploy your websites without having to deploy a back end, and it'll do some of the work for you. I just love it. So if you're looking for a way that you can actually deploy a website that only has front-end technology in it, gives you all the tools that you typically need for the back end without having to actually program the back end, then give them a try. Go check them out at netlify.com. Now, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, so I'm a software developer from Calgary, Canada. I work at a company called Verset, and we just build applications and websites, and we do a lot of design and consulting and that sort of thing. And I guess I was invited on the show to talk about React Conf.
Yep. Now, before we get rolling, I did see a pic on Adventures in Angular about building maintainable Angular apps. So it looks like you have moved around a bit in your career. You do a little bit of everything, or have you moved from Angular to React?
I've dabbled a little bit. It's because we do consulting. We do a little bit of everything, whatever the client needs. And so we started with Angular, and for now we're sticking with React for the most part, but I've kind of done like a little bit of both.
Yeah. It's just interesting to kind of see the movements that people make, whether they're trying to become more of a generalist or, they move from one community to the other and sort of the lessons they bring with them. And yeah, it's really, really interesting to talk through that. But what we brought you on to talk about, so maybe we'll dive into that at the end if there's time. What we brought you on to talk about is you have a post on the Verset Medium where you talk about talks worth watching at React Conf 2018.
Yeah, so I just kind of wrote that article after I attended React Conf. I saw how many hours of content that there were, and I realized that not everyone's going to have the time to kind of pick out the best talks and decide what they want to watch. And I didn't want anyone to miss anything good. And so I kind of picked out some of the best for what people should really go see if they're interested.
That makes sense. Do you want to just talk to us for a minute about what it's like to go to React Conf? I know that this year was a little bit different. They brought in some people I know very well, actually, to do the organizing. But yeah, what was it like? It was down in Las Vegas, if I remember right.
Yeah, so it was pretty close to Las Vegas. It was in Henderson, which is just a half an hour drive. And so the conference was hosted by Facebook and the React team. And they put this all on, all the official stuff. And kind of about the conference, I guess, it's a single track. So I was able to see every single talk, which was pretty nice because if you have a couple different tracks, sometimes it can get, you just miss out on stuff. So it was really nice to have just concurrent. And if you didn't want to see something, you could just step out and go outside. It was a beautiful day. And so it was just a great atmosphere. Lots of really smart people there. Lots of really interesting points of view. At lunch, everyone would sit down at tables and just kind of get to know each other and see what everyone does and bounce ideas off each other.
And
Justin, were either of you there?
I was not, no.
Yeah, I wasn't there either. But it wasn't held in Vegas this year, right?
Yeah, in Henderson, which is, just outside of Vegas.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I went about 2 years ago when it was in Silicon Valley area somewhere. I think it was Palo Alto.
Yeah, I think Henderson was a great location. It was right on Lake Las Vegas there. It was just, beautiful lake. A lot of people were staying in the hotel right there. So you just kind of go paddle boarding, or they had a whole bunch of activities. You could go bike riding and stuff. It was, really nice.
Really nice.
I'm curious about how you all approach conferences. Do any of y'all take notes while you're in the conference, or do you just kind of listen in, or how do you approach it?
I go to quite a few conferences, and I pretty much don't take any notes unless something really important that I want to kind of go back and go over. But I usually try to find out the best place to find the resources for all of the talks afterwards in one place, and then maybe bookmark that. A lot of times people will start a Twitter thread or something that has all the links to the presenters in their slide decks. That's a pretty good way to kind of like keep all the content together. But I spend about 50% of the time in talks and the other 50% of the time hanging out and meeting people. And I'm not antisocial, but it's kind of like I'm not very outgoing. So I kind of will try to get out of my element when I'm at these conferences and actually go and talk to people. And pretty much at all of these events that I've been to, especially in the JavaScript community, I'm sure it's like this in other programmer communities. Everyone's like, always really nice and open to talk and meeting you regardless of who they are.
I'm kind of the same way, except I spend a good deal more of my time talking to people than attending the talks. I will go to some of the talks if I'm really interested in them. And any notes I take are basically, how do I find this person so I can get them on one of the shows? And that's just a function of my focus. But I find that talking to people gives me a much better feel for where things are at than necessarily the talks. And so unless there's some really hot topic that I know I need to understand, I usually will go to the keynotes, or in the case of like the Microsoft conferences that I've been to, which I'm going to wind up going to Microsoft Build again in May. Yeah, I'll watch the keynotes online and then I'll go and meet people. And usually the other thing that happens is then by talking to people or finding a post like Adam's post, then I'll be like, oh, these were the ones not to miss, right? And so then I'll go watch the videos.
Yeah, my usual format is just I just try and see everything, to be entirely honest, because usually it's work sending me to a conference. And so I kind of try and make the most of it. And I just want to be able to come back to my team and kind of show and explain, here's what I learned. Here's all the new features to look forward to. So like, for example, for React Conf, they kind of had the hooks presentation. And I kind of, if I wasn't there for that, that would have been a pretty big deal if my coworkers had to go watch that video instead of having me be able to explain it.
Yeah, I like to approach going to a conference or a talk as a learning opportunity as well. So I like to speak, and it's always good to like see other people's techniques. And so I don't take a lot of notes when I go, but I always try to figure out what the hook is for a talk, like what the motivator is, like, what's the problem they're trying to solve, how are they presenting it. Just try to distill it down into like the base information, because there's not a lot of, generally it's really hard to put a lot of information in a talk, and like different people approach like really dense topics in different ways. And it's always kind of fascinating just to see people's techniques and try to learn from that.
Yeah.
So what are some of the big topics that came out of React Conf? I know they announced a bunch of stuff, or they talked about a lot of big features. And I know you already mentioned React hooks, but is there anything else like worth mentioning?
Yeah, we did like 18 episodes on hooks, didn't we? Or at least one or two. Basically,
just keeping up with the same flow of the actual community, because that's all they talk about right now anyway. So I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, like the big things this talk or this conference were hooks. Obviously, that was the big one by Dan Abramov. Ryan Florence then just kind of followed up that talk with a better description or like a more realistic use case of how to use hooks. There's two more talks. One was about suspense and lazily loading your app, and that was by Jared Palmer. He did that talk on suspense. And then there was also a talk on concurrent rendering in React and by Andrew Clark and Ryan Vaughn. And they both kind of had, like, those are both upcoming features. Those are going to be released in the next half year or so. And so those were kind of the big keynotes that were probably worth watching.
Yeah, those were super exciting. I recommend, if anybody hasn't watched those videos, to definitely check them out. Yeah, concurrent React is really going to change a lot of stuff, especially like data fetching. I'm pretty excited about it.
What exactly is the concurrent React? Is that using suspense to fetch data?
No, so concurrent React is it's basically allows React to run the render methods without blocking the main thread is kind of the main theme. So it if you were to be scrolling or have animations running, concurrent React allows new renders to occur while those animations and other effects continue to occur. So it prevents the UI from becoming janky. So if you have like a big computation in the background, it doesn't affect what's currently going on the page, which is going to be a pretty big deal for pretty heavy or animation intensive apps.
Yeah.
So is that something that you have to actually implement, or does that just actually work now out of the box, or will it work once it's available?
So that's going to be something that's pretty easy to implement, just like how right now you attach React to a DOM node. It's just a different way of attaching the DOM node when you create your React app, and then it'll just run in concurrent mode. And so it should be really easy to implement. There's a bunch of caveats with that. So if you're doing some not React-esque kind of things, then you might run into some weird edge cases where it might not render properly. But I think for the most part, most simple apps should be able to just switch over to concurrent mode seamlessly.
Yeah, there are things that people have to like think about, like caching and fallbacks, and like, you know, what happens if like the data isn't loaded here yet, or what happens if the data is like loads faster than we want to show, like a spinner or whatever. Like, but these things are really simple with concurrent React, much more simple than they are today. Like today, showing loading states can be pretty messy, and this makes it really clean. So.
Yeah, totally. And one thing to kind of note is that as of today, there's not much documentation around this. And so if you do try and go implement concurrent React in your current application, it's not supported. It's probably going to blow up in some way. And it's going to be hard to figure out because just there's no documentation on it. So that's kind of a caveat for if you're looking at it right now.
That's interesting because we're almost, 5 months out from the conference, and which means that we're theoretically halfway to the next conference, and we're still having, if you make it work, you're going to be inventing some of the way to make it work. Also,
suspense for data fetching isn't really actually available yet, and I don't think it will be. Maybe by the next React Conf, but it is something they like announced kind of or discussed at least.
Yeah, maybe that'd be interesting.
Yeah, Dan Abramov did that talk like a year ago about suspense for data fetching, and it's still we're still waiting on it. The React JS blog, they posted a timeline for when certain features are going to come out. So they said concurrent mode is going to be Q2 this year, and then suspense with data fetching is going to be mid 2019. So it could be soon. It could be
cool.
6 months, but hopefully before the next React Conf.
So are they going to be doing another React Conf next year? Because I know that they kind of like decided not to do one last year, and then at the last kind of like minute, I would say they decided to do one, and it was a little bit different, handled differently than the previous ones were, i.e. it was like done at a different time of the year, and it was also not handled by the Facebook people, but actually it was like sent out to a third party to manage. And I heard they did a good job on it. But do you know if they're going to have one for sure this year?
I don't think there's been anything confirmed yet. I definitely have seen some rumblings on Twitter about how the React team and the Facebook team thought it was a great conference and would love to do it again. I think they're looking into it. So I would say probably yes, but obviously I'm not involved enough to say.
Yeah, I can talk to my contacts and see if we can get people on the show to talk about, things when they announce things. But yeah, I also know that a lot of these things get played close to the vest until they make official announcements. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But from what I understood on the other end, talking to the people who organized it, that things went really well, and it sounded like they wanted to do it again. So
yeah, for sure. Have y'all actually dug into the implementation of suspense and or just like any of the theory around how it works? I find that
I like being held in suspense as far as it works.
It's super clever, I would say. They do some really interesting things.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I've done quite a bit with it, actually, just playing around, because I've created a bunch of demos, like getting suspense to work with like GraphQL and stuff, just to kind of learn it and see what's going on. And the way that they like throw a promise and then they kind of allow it to like bubble up to the next component. And the way that they've created that function that React Cache uses, that's all. Yeah, it's super interesting. It's not very intuitive, but it works. It was hard for me to wrap my head around it, and I've been using React for like a long time, so I can't imagine like someone new to the ecosystem trying to figure it out. that's unfortunate. But so I hope if they come out with some abstraction, it kind of like abstracts away all of that implementation detail, because I would say they're creating something that is already kind of solvable right now without it. So I'm hoping that this is going to be like a better user experience than what we had before, versus them just kind of doing it because for what other reasons, I don't know what that would be.
Yeah, for sure. I had always kind of thought that exceptions were a very expensive action, and like just the idea of like throwing exceptions during rendering seemed like, or relying on those specifically to prioritize work seemed like something that would be slow, but evidently not.
Suspense is kind of built for slow stuff anyway, right? Because
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. So I think it kind of fits that use case, even if it is expensive. I was talking to Jared Palmer when we were at React Conf, and he did his live coding presentation about suspense, and it was really cool, and just all the data fetching. And I talked to him after his presentation. He was saying like there's some edge cases in there that if you run into them, they get like pretty weird. Like caching is one of the really tricky issues there, because if you fetch that data and then you want to discard it, you need to have like a really well-built caching policy around that. So it's kind of an area that's going to be harder to figure out. But I think that's the reason why they put it off till mid-2019, is just so they can try and get all that figured out. And so Suspense kind of has like a smooth launch.
One thing I haven't really figured out is how Suspense is going to fit in with any types of data architecture. Like, how are you going to handle state at a global level with Suspense, because of the way that it's kind of like created? It just seems really unintuitive to me, but maybe I'm just not thinking about it right.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the idea around the caching as well. Like, I don't know where you put that cache, or if you want that at the component level or at the global level. Like, I think that's just part of the nature of why Suspense is so tricky right now. Like, they announced it like a year ago, and it still is a work in progress. So that's probably part of the reason why it's tricky to do, right?
Yeah, I guess the cache at a global level, actually, that kind of like makes me think about it a little differently. But that could be a way to do it, yeah.
Regardless, it'll definitely be interesting to see. I'm excited for the future.
Yeah. So one thing that I'm curious about, just looking at this list of curated talks, we've talked about some of them, but how did you pick the ones that you wanted to highlight here? I mean, some of them are kind of gimmies, where they're big announcements in the keynotes, but some of the rest of these, it's, why these and not some of the other talks that we're given?
It was mostly just whatever resonated the most with me. For example, there's a couple of React Native talks that they did that I'm sure were very interesting, but I've never worked with React Native, so I just kind of left them off the list because I can't really say objectively if I thought they were good or not. So I just kind of put a few things on here that I thought were really cool. So, for example, the new version of Create React App I thought was pretty exciting, because that's something we use at Verset, and I want to kind of highlight that. I thought that was pretty valuable. Even though it's just a 5-minute lightning talk, I thought it was valuable to see and like kind of understand the changes that they made.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just thought it was interesting because there's, for example, you mentioned what's new in Create React App, but it was a lightning talk. Like it was real short. Some of the other ones a little less so. Like SVG illustrations is not really something that's a mainstream React usage either. So yeah, some of these, I just thought it was interesting. It's like, oh, okay, what made that one stand out? And I love that you have, why you put it in. So
yeah, and so Verset, where I work, is a design. Like, we do a design. A big chunk of our work is design focused, and so that's why SVGs kind of resonated with me, is because that's something that I'm using every single day. And so when I see a talk about SVGs, it's maybe not the most exciting thing, but for everyone, but that's kind of something I use every day, and I thought that was what made it valuable.
Yeah, for sure. Do y'all have any conferences this year that you're really looking forward to? Any React specific or front end specific, or just general conferences?
I haven't really been looking at the list of conferences this year, but everyone I talked to has said that React Rally is also a great conference that I would love to check out, but I haven't really put too much thought into where I'm going to be going this year.
To me, the two best React conferences in the world are React Rally and React Conf. Then also React Amsterdam would be like my third. And then other than that, there's now like dozens or even hundreds of conferences that are like in the React realm. Like, I'm not exaggerating. Probably like, definitely in the 30s, 40s, 50s at this point. So it's kind of like crazy how big React has gotten. But there's just so many events too. It's not just in the React space. I feel like there's so many more events now than there was maybe 5 years ago. I don't know if it's just because I'm more in tune with the development community, or and it's always been this way, but I really feel like it hasn't been this way. But two of the other ones that I'm looking forward to are Chain React, which is a React Native conference, and also React Native EU, which is a React Native conference.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm planning to travel abroad this year, so I'm like thinking about maybe JS Conf EU or something like that. I haven't decided yet, but
yeah, I'm just browsing through. So reactjs.org has a list of conferences that they keep updated, and there's like 20 on this list so far, and that's only until September. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot more being tacked on just kind of as they get fleshed out. Like, yeah, they're all over the world. Like, there's just a few here from Iran, there's Poland, Australia. It's just like, yeah, everyone just wants to have their own conference to go to, I guess.
And then I think this year, React India and React Norway are both new. I don't know if they're on there or not.
Yeah, it looks
if
like
anyone's listening and they're going to be at any of these, I'll be at React India, React Norway, React Amsterdam, and App.js Conf and Chain React.
Yeah, this year for me, I mean, I do shows on all kinds of stuff, right? So I'm looking at going to NGConf and some of the Ruby conferences, and I'm also going to 2 podcasting conferences. But specifically for React, this year I'm really going to try and make it to React Rally because it's in Salt Lake. It's a half hour away. And then I'm probably going to try and make it to React Conf, especially if they hold it in Las Vegas, because that's a 5.5 hour drive from here. And I like staying in Las Vegas. So anyway, yeah, those are the ones that I'm really looking at. I'd love to go to one of the React Native conferences, but it's kind of hard to prioritize it because I can't travel every week. So as we record this, I'm going to Codebeam next week, which is Elixir Erlang conference. So yeah, I kind of get to all kinds of stuff. So
that sounds like fun.
I like Elixir a lot, so I'm jealous.
Yeah, I'm also kind of hoping to get to RubyConf again this year, and possibly Angular Connect, because I'm pretty connected to that community too. So one other thing that I'm wondering about is we look at this, because yeah, you've got the talks from React Conf. Some conferences I've been to, if you miss the hallway track, you don't miss a lot, right? You'd show up to the talks, everybody else is kind of there for the talks. For me, this is usually the larger conferences where there are so many people, it's just really hard to connect with people. And then some of the other conferences, as they get smaller, or, they do specific things to make the hallway track, a part of the conference one way or the other, you tend to get a little bit more out of the conversations and things like that as well. And knowing some of the folks that organized React Conf, I'm guessing that they had some elements of a hallway track running. But I'd love to hear, overall how the feel of the conference was, and, how easy it was to get to know people while you were there.
Yeah. So just because it was a single track, everyone had lunch at the same time. Everyone had their breaks at the same time. So it kind of meant that if you want to chat with a speaker or go make some new friends or something, you always had time to go have lunch with them and go sit down with them, which was really nice because it really helps build those connections between the community and see what other people are doing and what they think of the talks that are going on and how they can use these new tools in different ways. And so it was kind of a really nice format that they had at React Conf. It was, I think, around 600 people. So it was a good size, but it wasn't enormous. It wasn't overwhelming. And so there was a lot of different people you could just walk up to, and a lot of people are sitting out of a talk. And so you can just go step outside if you want to go meet someone out there. But yeah, they definitely made it so that they really encouraged that communication and just getting to know each other. They kind of baked that into part of the conference, which was really nice.
That's awesome. This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give you full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at sentry.io.
So what was your favorite talk?
Hooks was the most exciting by a large margin. But aside from the keynotes, I really resonated with the talk by Thomas Ehrlich. He did Let React Speak Your Language, which was a talk about internationalization in React. So Thomas built a Babel plugin to help facilitate the different internationalization and translations within React apps. And my company is doing these different translations. And I thought that was a really interesting talk. That's kind of one that really hit the mark for me.
That's awesome. Yeah.
That's an aspect I tend to leave off my apps. So yeah, anything that makes it easier.
Yeah, internationalization is a really tricky one to get right. And so that's kind of every time I see something about internationalization in React, that I really try and latch onto that and figure out how can we be doing this better. And because at Verset, there's a lot of clients that come to us and say, we need to build this app with internationalization in mind. And so that's kind of like at the forefront of what we're doing.
So how do you typically do that? I worked on an app that had internationalization a few years ago, but it's been a while. I think we had like a JSON documents or even objects. I forgot exactly what it was, where we kept the different translations that we supported, and we would basically have like a plugin or library choose based on the language that would set the actual text from that document. Is that kind of approach that you've used, or like what do you use, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, so basically the JSON file with all the different translations is pretty standard. I can't remember the format offhand, but there's like a standardized format for doing internationalization, so you can how to inject parameters into a string and that sort of thing. So there is kind of a standardized format, and there's libraries kind of built around that format. So I think Thomas Ehrlich's library is kind of built around using that format and how to easily inject parameters into your strings. And that's kind of the key part of what he's doing.
Gotcha.
And so in React, a lot of the time, it's just you have rather than writing out the text directly, you say, here's the key or here's the English language string of what I want to translate. And then when you're doing your translation, it will then look up that key and inject it into your application as a string. So it sounds like what you were doing is pretty much the same as what is the kind of the standard here.
Cool.
Another interesting talk that I took a look at, another lightning talk, was components as units of work. And that's basically the idea that not every component has to render something. Sometimes if you just want to have, just use the component's life cycles just to say, well, maybe not so much with hooks anymore, but like a component did mount or something, you can use those life cycles to perform an effect on the page and without actually having to render anything. So that was kind of an interesting talk for me that I kind of thought helped change my perspective on how to use class components in React.
Yeah, I wonder how much that'll change with hooks. I mean, obviously, life cycles aren't something that you need dedicated components for so much anymore. But the idea that a component doesn't necessarily have to render something to be a component, that it could, have other concerns, I think is still valid, maybe even in the hooks world, because like when you look at a component, like how things are kind of broken down and like what the responsibilities are, it's still useful sometimes to abstract things out a little bit more.
Oh, totally. I think use effect and use layout effect will kind of be maybe the alternative to rendering null in the future, potentially. But I think that's kind of an area that hasn't yet been explored too much. So I'm kind of curious to see how that plays out in the next few years.
So at this point, what are you hoping that they cover in the next React Conf?
I think the big one is hopefully going to be suspense. Hopefully that doesn't get pushed back any further. But it's kind of hard to say. One of the big things that they covered, or the kind of the focuses of React Conf this year, was they tried to find a lot of real world examples of React in context. And so they kind of were not necessarily just showcasing just React app. It was apps that were doing Reacts that were trying to make the world a better place, that were using artificial intelligence and machine learning. It wasn't so much just saying, look at these React features. It was more so, look at how React is making technology and making the world a better place. And I thought that was kind of a interesting perspective to put on it. For example, Rodrigo, oh man, I don't know if I can say his last name, Quezada. He's from Mexico City, and he did a talk called React for Social Change, and about how he's using React, but also machine learning to try and improve public transit in Mexico City to help dispatching buses, just to help people get around more easily. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective, because it's not just React that he's talking about at React Conf. It's kind of how to improve his city and build an app, not just using React. And I thought it was kind of a cool perspective that they kind of put on that.
Yeah, one thing that I hope they cover in the next React Conf is React Fire, so there's a PR open or an issue open for modernizing the React DOM to kind of make it smaller and more efficient. Performance is a primary thing that I concern myself with. So seeing what they come up with there, maybe hearing something about Prepack and their efforts in that area would be really awesome. React is awesome, but it's not small. So just hearing more about their strategies for kind of optimizing there would be nice.
Do you know if React Fire is going to have any impacts to how we would be using React, or is it more of a under the hood change?
So far as I'm aware, it's more of an under the hood change, but there are definitely some changes. There's at least one hook or one event change, migrating from on change to make that on input. So there's some smaller things. I think the biggest interruption is, so they want to stop using class name and start using class. So that's obviously a pretty significant change, but that's something easy enough to write a polyfill for. Or not a polyfill, a code mod. But I think the biggest thing, the biggest change of this is really under the hood, and it's around just simplifying the event system. The synthetic event system in React right now has a lot of it does a lot of standardization for browsers that maybe it doesn't need to do so much of anymore. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of issues there. It could break compatibility with some older browsers, specifically older versions of IE. So, if you're still supporting those, then that's definitely a concern. But I don't know. It looks really interesting. So I'm excited to see what they do there.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned Internet Explorer, because Create React app by default, I think they've kind of moved away from supporting IE 11. Or they're at least trying to move away from that direction. And so they still include the polyfills, but you have to manually pull them in. And so I think that's kind of the direction that I wouldn't be surprised if React kind of went in that direction, just kind of saying Internet Explorer is getting pretty old. We kind of have to drop support eventually.
Yeah, IE 11 is still, it's not end of life yet. I don't believe. So I understand definitely the desire to want to drop IE altogether, but there are still a lot of places that try to support older versions of IE still, even though they're technically all end of life.
Yeah, we still support IE 11 for pretty much everything we build, just because there's so many people out there, so many businesses that still use IE 11.
Yeah, for sure. I did government contracting for a while, and they were locked on IE9, and that was a painful existence. And even IE9 is much better than Lord help IE6. Anybody remember those days?
Oh my God, those were rough times.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'm looking at is, I mentioned your article on maintainable Angular, and I'm curious if you ever made it out to any of the Angular conferences and what you thought might have been different between the two.
I've never actually made it out to an Angular conference. I really pushed hard for going on NG Cruise, but that never panned out, unfortunately. That would have been a really fun one. I basically have the same perspective that I think everyone has about Angular versus React, is that Angular has just a lot more baked in. So it has the router. It has when I was using it, which was a while ago, they had the module system, and they had everything just kind of seemed to be part of a cohesive system. Whereas React is just React.
Yeah, my experience between the two has been it's interesting because sometimes I really want all the stuff baked in, and sometimes I'm just like, yeah, just let me kind of pick my own stack, and as long as it's not too hard to tape everything together, I guess, then then I'm good with it. So it's definitely interesting in the approach, but I do find that a lot of the people between the communities have a lot in common. So, for all the differences in the framework, I find that we're all trying to solve a lot of the same problems, and we have a lot of the same interests. So, yeah, it's definitely interesting to see where the different communities end up because of those things.
Yeah, I definitely think there's React could take a lot of suggestions from Angular, I guess, just because they do have like a lot of really good ideas there, like how they baked in observables by default. I think that's great, whereas React doesn't do that. And while you can use like MobX or kind of wrap observables in, it's just having it baked in by default was kind of a great way to kind of say, this is the technology we want to use, and we're going to be objective and decisive about saying this is what you should also be using for your applications. And I kind of really like that because it kind of got me to learn new technology, and it got me to really take advantage of it because I was kind of forced to.
Yeah, that definitely seems to be not the React way by and large, though. A lot of the churn that's happened, over the years in the React ecosystem is, in part because the React team takes a hard stance on we're focusing on solving this one problem, and all these other problems are up to you to solve or up to the community. So, like, I agree in part. Like, I like having easy solutions that fit together well. So I came to the React ecosystem from Vue. I started in Vue. That was like more of my thing. And I liked how Vue said, here's this like simple rendering library, but then here's also all these other pieces that fit really well that are like, we're kind of building these things for you. You don't have to use them, but if you need to reach for a router, if you need to reach for something, it's like readily available and built for purpose. But, at the same time, we've seen a lot of innovation come out of the React community because they've had to solve a lot of these problems that React itself doesn't try to tackle. And the React team is relatively small. So they've been able to put a lot of time and innovation into things like suspense and hooks and like these things that are really dense topics that are like hard to intuit, but become this really, kind of revolutionary way of like building UI. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, that's I find it kind of interesting how, like, for example, a router isn't baked into React. And I think, well, yeah, it does kind of encourage more innovation and it encourages more people to write these libraries. But kind of the go-to is everyone just uses React Router because it just seems like the right one to use. It has the most support. And so it kind of still has that kind of same end result that everyone's still using the same thing, except for the people who have weird use cases and need to go find their own router or something. And so I think even though they do have like the React team focuses on the core thing and the community builds the rest, there's still a lot of these packages that are still just the de facto go-to. And I think that, well, that doesn't like stifle innovation or anything. It kind of encourages people to hopefully encourages people to get involved in building their own packages. But yeah, I think it kind of has a similar end result.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's, there are always trade-offs.
Yeah, we've been using Reach Router a lot recently, which is, I think, React Training, or no, not React Training. Ryan Florence, who used to be part of React Training, something going on there. But yeah, he built this new router, which is really cool and exciting, but it kind of has a couple of caveats. And so it's kind of been a hard transition between, do we want to use this new router, which is a lot thinner and cleaner, or do we want to use the old React router, which is much more mature and is much more stable? And so that's kind of a interesting situation we've been dealing with.
Yeah, we actually use the found router because it has a relay hook or a relay plugin. So RC's really heavily invested in Relay. So React Router didn't really work out of the box with that, but Found does a really great job. So yeah, I mean, it just goes back to like there being no official solution. So there's a bunch of people who like tackle these things in a bunch of different ways. But it can be really beneficial because, there's a wide swath of the community that, tackles problems in many different ways. Like, especially, if you're using GraphQL, maybe you use Relay or maybe you use Apollo or whatever. And, some of these approaches aren't always compatible. And it's hard for one library to support all things, right? That's a really hard sell. So.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of probably something that the Angular team struggles with, I imagine, is that they kind of have built all these base packages and now they have to maintain them and deal with all these issues and bug fixes. And that kind of would take away from the time building the core Angular, I imagine, which must also be a frustration, but I don't know.
They have quite a large group of people working on it, and they've got the work divvied out pretty well. So generally what will happen is if there is a slowdown in any one area, it'll be on one of the peripheral things. So Angular material will get released a little bit later than Angular or, things like that. So, generally what I've seen in the Angular community is that some of the rest of this work will come along after they release a new version of the core Angular. And the nice thing is, though, is that Google tends to use a lot of the, I guess, edge versions of Angular. And so it's still pretty stable, even if it's not, general release. But yeah, it's interesting to see how that works too, because React, as you said, is so tightly focused, and then you have all the other pieces that if Facebook does support them, they're kind of on their own team, or they're kind of moving along independent of React instead of tied to a particular version of React. So
yeah, that's something I've been reading about as well. Is that I think that's why React has such strong backwards compatibility, is because they don't want to do any breaking changes, because then Facebook is going to be having to upgrade like their enormous code base all to React 17 or something. So like they've been doing a lot of small incremental changes that still include backwards compatibility. So they can still use all these new exciting features like hooks and possibly concurrent React, but they don't have to go code mod or go rewrite a whole bunch of code to change their existing code base. Have you heard about how the Google team manages Angular versions? I'd be curious to see how they would handle upgrades, because that seems like a much trickier process if you have breaking changes every 6 months or every year or so.
Yeah, so one of the newer things, I know this isn't an Angular show, but it's always interesting to compare. So the Angular CLI now has an update or upgrade feature. I can't remember which keyword it is. I mix that up on like everything that has both. It's like but anyway, so you can just run the ng update. I think it's update because ng upgrade is still the upgrade utility from Angular JS or Angular version 1 to Angular version 6, 7, whatever version they're on now. So yeah, so you just get in and you just run the ng update, and it will actually go through and update all the versions of everything, and and try and keep the compatibility there with the new version of Angular. So I'm pretty sure that React releases patches, in a similar manner. And so, you just apply it and you're off to the races. So unless you're doing something really out there, or you have some custom library that you've pulled in that you've locked in too tightly to a particular version of Angular, then you should be okay. And generally, the breaking changes aren't that drastic. It hasn't been so insane that, you have to move one way or the other. And lately, the big change that they've been talking about is Angular Ivy, which is the rendering engine, and some aspects related to that. And in a lot of ways, most people probably won't feel it one way or the other. It'll just be more efficient. Your build size will, it may be smaller in some instances. It opens up a whole bunch of possibilities moving forward. And so, yeah, they're reworking a lot more of the internal stuff that you're probably not going to touch with your own code anyway. So we'll, over the next year, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And then we'll start seeing things open up in other areas that they kind of designed to open up because of these changes. So over the next little while, you're probably pretty safe. But yeah, generally, it's not that much. You're not leaping forward a ton. You'll see the leaps forward in some of the supporting libraries and things like that.
That's interesting. That's just a interesting perspective to have about how Angular works, because I've been out of that area for a while. So it's kind of interesting to see how, it doesn't sound like it's a big deal, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, Angular JS to Angular, or Angular 1 to 2 was a big leap. Angular 2 to 4, much less so, but was still a move. But since Angular 4, upgrading has not been a major undertaking in any sense. So, yeah. And the last 2 updates that you've been able to get publicly, you just fire up the CLI and tell it to update, and it will work or very close to work, depending on how much custom stuff you have. All right. Well, should we do some picks, or is there anything else we wanted to cover?
I think that's it for me.
Before we do that, though, Adam, if people want to find you online, where do they find you or your stuff?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at @Laycock. I don't tweet much, though. Not very exciting. I'm on GitHub under Laycock, LAYCOCK. I have a personal website, which is adamlaycock.ca. And on Medium, I'm at adam.laycock. And that's kind of the areas where you can find me if you really want to.
Cool. This episode is brought to you by TripleByte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, TripleByte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. TripleByte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/react. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through TripleByte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus. All right, well, let's do some picks. Natter, do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, so lately I've been blogging on dev.to. It's a blogging platform that's kind of like specified for developers or specific for developers. It's very similar to Medium, but again, it's kind of like focused on developers. So if you want to follow me there, I have my profile there, dev.to/dabit3, DABIT and the number 3. And so I would definitely check it out.
Awesome. Justin, how about you? Do you have some picks for us?
Yeah, so I've got 3 things. One, there was this tool trending on GitHub today that I thought was really cool. It's called Code Crumbs. So it parses your code and builds a kind of an explorable map, and you can have these specialized comments in your code to like raise things. So it just gives you a good way to get like a high level overview of your code base, and you can have like different code crumbs to like tell different stories or whatever. I don't know. I thought it was neat. Second, so at RRU we use TypeScript a lot, and most of the time when you're using TypeScript, you use TSLint. What news in the open source world is that TSLint is being deprecated, and we're all going to consolidate on ESLint. So that's awesome. Good for the community to all be behind one tool. So I'm excited to see that start moving. And last thing, so RC was unfortunately the recipient of a DDoS attack last week, and it kind of took up a lot of my time. And kind of in the meantime, I found a great Express compatible package for Node called Rate Limiter Flexible. So it's a rate limiting middleware that's kind of designed to be very performant. A lot of like customization, like set like global rate limits for your entire application, per process rate limits, fallbacks for things. Like it's really, really awesome. And I'm going to do a write-up on the rate limiting like solution that we came up with. But yeah, that's my picks.
Awesome. This week, for me, I've been focusing less on the code stuff and more on the podcast stuff. One of the things that I've been spending a lot of time in is Notion.so. It's kind of a blend between a wiki and, I guess, sort of Google Docs, collaborative docs. So you can add like tables and things like that to it. Not quite to the extent that you can put like formulas and stuff in, but for everything else, it's it's pretty awesome. So I'm going to pick that. If you have like a team where you need to collaborate on documentation and things like that, it is really nice. A few other picks that I have just related to that. I just listened to a book called Effective Executive by Peter Drucker. Of course, I'm listening to the 50th anniversary edition. So, this is kind of an older book, but it's got a lot of great ideas in it. If you're team lead or you're trying to make a difference on the team you're on, or even if you're just an individual contributor, there are a lot of terrific things in there that I just recommend that people check out and get involved in. So he'll walk you through how to solve problems and how to essentially just be more effective and more productive. So I'm going to pick that. And lastly, I believe this episode will come out after the episode that I'm going to pick on JavaScript Jabber. But I had a friend of mine, Manny Vea, who I talk to every Friday. If you want to listen to he and I and a couple of other guys who all used to be developers and now run a business of some kind, entreprogrammers.com, like entrepreneur, entreprogrammers.com. We talk about all kinds of stuff there. And anyway, I had him come on Ruby Rogues and then on JavaScript Jabber and just talk about being productive. And it was awesome. Just tremendous advice, great stuff. Essentially what he did is he went and read like the top 50 productivity books. And then he did book summaries for all of them on video. And you can go buy these if you want. But what came out of it was that, bringing him on the show, he could basically say, look, we've got these strategies and these are the books that it came out of and this is the background of it. And it was really, really interesting just to dive in. And I know a lot of people out there are looking to get into programming or looking to enhance their career. In a lot of ways, just upping your effectiveness or productivity is a terrific way to go. So anyway, all these picks are kind of around that. And the Notion.so is essentially where I'm writing out the processes for managing the podcasts. And so that's another form of productivity that we're taking there. So yeah, anyway, lots of picks and lots of ideas. Adam, do you have some picks for us?
I do. So you had Kent Dodds on your show the other day, or a few weeks ago, I guess, a few months ago. Mm-hmm. And he put out a blog post recently about titled, Please Stop Building Inaccessible Forms and How to Fix Them. And I thought that kind of really hit the mark with me because making the web accessible is hugely important. People operate browsers with screen readers, with keyboard only. They can't use the mouse. And just using these basic accessibility features is super important to a lot of people. And so I think that this article is just one of those little accessibility fixes that is going to be really valuable for a lot of people. And it's worth giving it a read, just even if you already know about how labels work, it's just have a glance over, make sure you're doing them right. I also just finished reading a book called Clean Architecture by Robert Martin, I believe. Mm-hmm. And I know that's kind of a baseline programming book, but I think that, or maybe not baseline, but it's like a very good programming book about how to architect a piece of software. And while it doesn't directly apply to React, because it is more about object-oriented software, I think there's still a lot that can be taken out of it and put into React applications. And I found that to be a really good read as well. And my last pick, I just got to shout out myself. I wrote an article called Don't Eject Your Create React App. And I just kind of thought I wrote a good article. I want to bring it up.
Nice. Very nice. Robert C. Martin, or Uncle Bob Martin, he's one of my favorites. And it's funny because you're picking a book and it's like, hey, it's this architecture book and it's out there. But a lot of times what I see is I see people that get in and they know how to build stuff in React or build stuff in Rails or build stuff in whatever, right? Whatever language or framework they're in. And when it comes to actually writing good software, nobody taught them those fundamentals. And so they wind up learning that the hard way by having tightly coupled code or running into, oh, well, if I had arranged this just a little bit differently or used this design pattern, which is all sort of basic stuff that you'll pick up along the way, things would get a lot easier. And in a lot of cases, it's easier to read a book about it and then kind of absorb the ideas than it is to go and bang your head against the wall when you have to refactor a complicated system without breaking anything. So, yeah, I highly recommend people go check out Bob Martin's books. and a few other people I'll just throw in there that are also some of my favorites to read are Michael Feathers. He's got a lot of great stuff. Kent Beck, if you're looking for sort of practices and, ideas on how you could do things a little bit differently within your team and how you code. But he's also got books about ideas on how you arrange code as well. And a lot of his books are in small talk, which makes it all the more fascinating because you read it and then you're going, I could really apply this to something that's very much not small talk. So anyway, sorry to pile on your pick, but I think it's important for people to go and continue to learn. So,
Oh, totally agree.
Yeah, definitely software architecture in general is a topic that more people should be broadly interested in. It's a deep well of information, but there's a lot of things that tie back to your like day-to-day work. And I definitely highly recommend it. So there's a software architecture conference that goes on that's hosted by O'Reilly twice a year. Once I think it's in New York and once it's in Paris. So I went to that last year in January, and it was probably one of the most like informative and useful conferences I think I've ever been to. So I definitely highly recommend, that to anybody who might be interested in learning more about software architecture.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you for coming, Adam.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right. We'll go ahead and wrap this one up, and we will be back, folks, next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.